dear listener, and welcome to Season 3 of the Arms Control Poseur podcast, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies and funded by the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. In this season of the podcast, one of our three rotational hosts will guide you through current challenges faced in arms control. Hosted by either Timothy Wright, Fabian Hinz, or myself, Wolf-Christian Paes, we will cover various timely challenges and issues in the world of arms control. Our podcast will cover topics ranging from new technologies, the diversion of firearms, to missile programs and technologies or sanctions regimes. So, without further ado, let's get started. All right, our guest today is Roy Isbister, who leads Safer World on conventional arms. He has more than 20 years of experience in developing and implementing strategies to promote the adoption of responsible arms transfer control strategies nationally, regionally, and internationally. Today, we're talking about the Arms Trade Treaty, and it's a good time to talk about the ATT because the ATT has just celebrated its 10th anniversary. Roy, good to have you.
Well, it's good to be here. Thanks.
So, Roy, what can you tell us about the ATT? 10 years in, maybe this is a good moment to reflect how it came about and also how it differs from other arms control regimes.
So, I mean, it's 10 years old now, but the kind of idea actually springs from the civil society, and you're going back 30 years to the early 1990s. It was just a civil society project for quite a while. Also, Nobel Peace Laureates were involved. And then in about 2005, it suddenly gained some momentum amongst states when the UK came on board. It quickly arrived in the UN in 2006, and then there was a process which eventually led to negotiations 2012 and 2013, and then it ultimately entered into force in 2014. And what it does is it regulates the international transfer of conventional arms. That's all conventional arms, from individual rounds up to aircraft carriers, fighter aircraft, naval ships. Doesn't address biological, chemical, nuclear weapons, etc. And it only touches on the international transfer. It's not concerned with what happens within the states, movements within the states' borders, but it's about arms that are traded, transferred internationally. And it sets the rules when it is okay and when it is not okay to transfer those arms. And those rules center around issues such as peace and security, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, terrorism, organized crime, gender-based violence, and the risk of diversion of arms from their intended recipient to an unintended recipient or unintended use.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the members of the ATT. I mean, the ATT is obviously a state regime, but it's not a regime under the control or under the umbrella of the United Nations. So how is it different from the other arms control regimes out there?
It's not universal. It doesn't, as you say, it doesn't fall under the umbrella of the UN. And there are currently 113 states parties, which is about to increase to 115. Those are from all regions of the world, though some regions are better represented than others. For example, the Middle East and South Asia is not very well represented. Europe, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, there are a lot of states parties there. In terms of how much of the trade it captures, there are some large exporters and some large importers who've not yet been persuaded to join, whose conduct in some cases, I would suggest, means that they probably shouldn't join at this stage.
And who are those, if I may ask?
So Russia would be like a very obvious example of a state that hasn't joined and has never shown any intention of joining. You've got some other large states, I wouldn't class the same as Russia certainly, but states such as India, a number of the states in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia that have not joined. The US is a bit of a special case. They are signatory to the treaty, but they are not a state party. Now, being a signatory is kind of a halfway house where they agree not to do anything to run counter to the object and purpose of the treaty. But then the US, under the Trump administration, did a strange kind of pseudo withdrawal from the treaty, which means that their status is a kind of a bit of a gray area. So there are states that are missing. There are also an awful lot of states that are captured by the treaty and are obliged to stick to all the provisions.
Is there a way to quantify how many percentage of the global arms market are basically covered by the ATT at the moment?
I think it's difficult to come up with an actual figure, but I mean, clearly, if the US is not a state party and the US is by far the largest exporter in the world, then that's significant. Again, it has that kind of halfway house status. Russia, again, has been a significant exporter, a little less since the invasion of Ukraine. And then you've got some of the large exporters, such as from the Middle East and from India, who are not importers. So it's a significant portion of the trade which is not covered, but a significant portion that is.
Where do you think the ATT differs from UN agreements, other than obviously that it's not global in nature?
Well, I suppose it is the only treaty which is regulating the conventional arms, all conventional arms, and that has legal force. You've got a program of action that applies to just to small arms and light weapons, but that is just a political declaration. Given that its regulatory nature, it's unlike other regimes which are basically saying that there's certain equipment that some states should not be entitled to possess or to use. This is dealing with equipment that is acknowledged as legitimate equipment for use in self-defense, in domestic security, but so it's addressing the use of that equipment rather than the existence of the equipment. And again, different to cluster munitions and landmines, for example, which clearly are outlawing equipment. The conventional arms are not outlawed. They are acknowledged as legitimate for trading and for use.
You said that one of the key criteria for whether or not an export license should be granted under the ATT is the role of human rights and willingness to uphold international legal norms. Could you give us some example about how this process actually takes place in practice? So if a country wants to import, I don't know, a frigate from the UK or from Germany, British or the German export control authorities then would presumably do some sort of a assessment under the ATT criteria, whether this is a green light or not. Given your experience, do you know how this works in practice?
To a certain extent, but ultimately the kind of process kind of lives inside a black box. There's an understanding of how the system works at a general level and in theory. So yes, you'll know who the particular authorities are who are involved in a decision-making process, the criteria that they are supposed to apply when making a decision. There's certainly plenty known about the kind of process at the general level that is supposed to be followed and the information sources that states would be seeking out, the kinds of people that they were in institutions that they might be asking, in theory, the contact that they would be having with the importing state. But then when it comes down to the actual individual decision, that tends to be quite a secretive process. It's a constant source of frustration to people such as myself, that when you are dealing with difficult marginal cases, and it needs to be acknowledged that there are cases that are, different people of good faith would be coming to different conclusions about what's the right thing to do. Those cases in the margins, or the right at the middle, but there's no information generally shared about how those decisions are actually made. So it is a source of frustration.
Could you give us some examples about transfers where a license was declined based on ATT criteria from recent years?
It's a surprisingly difficult question to answer because most of the states that are most transparent in this area have long histories of export controls and they have their national systems in place already. When asked about this, they tend to say that we've applied our national controls that are consistent with our obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty, and that's the basis for our decision. So in theory, that should mean that where there are applications declined, the Arms Trade Treaty being applied, but states have been very reluctant to say that that's how things work. So it's a frustrating process to understand exactly how the ATT rules are being applied.
And with more than 100 member state parties to the ATT, not all of them presumably have the same kind of sort of arms export control authorities that you have in the UK and the same history of sort of licenses and whatnot. How do you ensure compliance in this context? I mean, in the sense of that all the member states are able to have a universal way of adopting the process. Their definition of human rights is identical in practical terms. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. So there are some states that have joined the Arms Trade Treaty which have very little experience export control, are going to have very very few arms exports coming up in the next year or so. Obviously, that could be changing in future. And those states may have had in the past, for example, a system of presidential decree where the president just decides whether it's a good idea or not. So what the Arms Trade Treaty requires of these states is to set up a national system which lays out the process and the rules that are to be followed. And each state can set up its own system, which makes sense because everyone has their own traditions, their own different departments that are involved in different ways. So it makes perfect sense that each state will set up its own system, but there needs to be that kind of basis of explaining what the system is, making sure that's established in law, and then establishing that certain rules will be followed. And so it could be that the state decides what the national system is that the president decides. So it could still be a presidential decision. However, the president will be obliged to follow the rules that are in the Arms Trade Treaty when making that decision.
And you already mentioned that civil society played an important role in making sure that the ATT came into being. 10 years on, what role does civil society play in the context of the ATT?
That varies across the board. So there will be civil society will play a role at the national level. So in the way that individual states force the treaty, there's a potential role for local civil society to be working to hold governments to account. There is a transparency mechanism in the treaty. States are supposed to report on their national system, report on their exports and imports. So it should be an opportunity for local civil society to engage at that level. There are some states which involve them to a greater or lesser extent in the process. And so that gives them an opportunity to influence at the national level there. Though again, it will be highly unusual for them to be inside that black box I talked about where they're actually involved in a licensing decision. And then at the international level, the annual process, which culminates in a conference of states parties where all the states parties and other interested states come together to discuss progress and lack of progress and plans for the future, etc. And civil society is in the room for those discussions as well, most of which are fully in the public domain, though there are some particular aspects where it's the state parties operating confidentially. So there is an opportunity for civil society to engage and to try and influence the way that states are implementing the treaty.
I mean, you and I, we've both been in this field for a while. I remember the discussions around the POA almost 20 years ago. In some way, that was probably the high time of civil society engagement. And, I think there was a feeling that finally things were moving in the right direction, that there was a window of opportunity for better arms control. Now, looking back, it seems in some way, our movement has lost steam, right? So there isn't as much engagement, there isn't as much attention to arms control discussion as there was 20 years ago. Where do you think civil society is going? I mean, you have a long relationship with the global coalition and all of that. Do you think this is just a temporary low point, or has the world around us changed in such a way that we're now talking more about return maybe to a more militarized world as opposed to a world without weapons?
I think we kind of look back now on that period that you're talking about, and right through up until when the Arms Trade Treaty was adopted in 2014. Look back on that as the golden age, if you like, though we might not have felt that at the time. And I think we've forgot there's a couple of forces at work that are kind of working against us, if you like. I think the geopolitical environment has obviously deteriorated, and that has an impact across the board. And the Arms Trade Treaty suffers from that kind of overall mood, just as other areas do. And also the funding environment has changed markedly. Money is much tighter than it used to be. And to turn up to Geneva and try and engage with states on this issue is an expensive business. And so we're finding it much harder, I think, as a civil society, as a rule, to just be present in the same way that we were. I do think it's very easy to get caught up in the moment. Things ebb and flow over time, and I think we are, the pendulum is swinging against us at the moment. And I like to think the pendulum is going to swing back at some point, and that's when the opportunity for momentum kind of appears again. But even with that, there has a lot been going on, which I think civil society should look on with some satisfaction, and the news is not all bad. So, we keep struggling on.
That's good to hear. Now, let's talk a little bit about the 10th Conference of State Parties to the ATT. We are recording this podcast at the end of August 2024. 1 week ago, the 10th Conference of State Parties took place in Geneva, as you said. What were the main new developments that came out of that conference?
I mean, to be honest, the week spent in a very large conference room with a lot of people making a lot of speeches doesn't feel the most exciting way of spending your time. So you do have to kind of delve down into the weeds a bit to kind of try and understand what's actually happening. And there are reasons to be disappointed, but there's also reasons to feel cause for optimism. There is a history in the Arms Trade Treaty in these conferences that continues, which is to states to prefer to concentrate on processes and systems than actual decision making and actual compliance, if you like, at the level of the decision. And certainly we saw that again. There's a lot of talk about building national systems, a lot of talk about bringing additional states into the treaty called universalization, about how international assistance to support new states parties, etc., how that's developing. Those are all perfectly useful and valid things to be talking about, but if that's all you talk about, that's kind of not quite enough. And there's been pressure applied by civil society as best we can to start talking about actual contexts where we see arms transfers as problematic or deserving some interrogation, at least deserving interrogation. And there's a lot of resistance to that. There has been a lot of resistance. We see that continuing. However, we are seeing possibly the beginning of a bit of a shift there, and that there are more states acknowledging that this issue of compliance is relevant for states to be discussing. I don't think it's as if the dam is going to burst in the next few months or the next year, but we may be seeing the beginning of a bit of a shift. If we just go back kind of a little bit of the history of this, when the issue of arms supplies to Saudi Arabia in the context of the Yemen war a few years ago, civil society was arguing that this needed to be discussed, and this was just a non-issue. It wasn't going to happen. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we again raised that as a subject of interest for states to explain what their policies were on exporting to Russia, what their policies were on exporting to Ukraine. Again, a surprising amount of pushback there, because I was expecting some states would feel much more comfortable explaining this is our export policy to Russia and this is our export policy to Ukraine, but there was still a lot of pushback. And now we've got the situation with Israel and Gaza. Again, a lot of pressure being applied to talk about this, a lot of resistance, but this time we had the state of Palestine as a state party raising the issue itself, so it wasn't civil society raising the issue, and the rules of procedure of the Conference of States Parties meant that had to be, if there was a state party raising the issue, then states had to discuss it.
You spoke about Israel and Palestine. I mean, we hear from the global south a lot of people who speak about the Western perspective being problematic because, I mean, basically Israel's way of warfare in Gaza is seen by many as violating IHL norms, as you're well aware. Yet a lot of European countries and of course the United States continue their supplies of weapons with seemingly comparatively few restraints. And I've heard from colleagues in the Arab world, for example, how do you square this? You always insist on compliance with human rights norms, international humanitarian law, yet nothing changes when it is about Israel. How is this being discussed in Geneva?
It's a good question, and it's what is widely seen as hypocrisy is a huge issue for the health of the Arms Trade Treaty. I think it's very important to state that this is not a problem with the Arms Trade Treaty. It's a problem with the way that some states are implementing the treaty. If they were to apply the rules as written, then we wouldn't have this. And the fact that it is some very significant states as exporters that are seen as problematic doesn't help either. I mentioned before how it was in 2005 when the UK threw its weight behind the treaty that things started to move. My sense, just to be clear, I'm not from the UK, so I don't have a dog in that fight, but I would say that the UK did more than any other single state to bring the Arms Trade Treaty into existence. And yet, with Saudi Arabia and with Israel, the UK has performance in implementing the treaty has been very poor, and other states know this and they recognize it. And yet this year we had one of the elements that was introduced into the Conference of States Parties was a political declaration that was celebrating 10 years of the Arms Trade Treaty. This was introduced by the UK and promoted by the UK. Now, there's nothing in that political declaration that anybody could object to. And in fact, it's disappointing in that all it does effectively, it restates what states agreed 10 years ago and says we still agree with that. So it didn't move things forward at all. It is a distraction in terms of the amount of time that it takes up when there are other issues that need urgent attention. And again, having the UK at the forefront of this is highlighting the way that hypocrisy can undermine the treaty. And so it's a huge problem. It's very obvious to people. And this is one of the reasons why we need to get these discussions into the Arms Trade Treaty process so that people have an opportunity to hear how in this case, the UK, but other states in other contexts, how they justify their decisions. That's a challenge to the implementation of the treaty for sure.
Early on, we spoke about how countries like the Russian Federation or India are currently not members of the ATT, and certainly in the case of the Russian Federation, also not likely to become a member anytime soon, or North Korea or Iran for that matter. China, to me, seems to be an interesting case because China is, from what I understand, a member of the ATT. Yet at the same time, China has been mentioned repeatedly in the context of sort of arms exports to problematic countries, including Iran, over the years. As somebody who's been watching the ATT for a long time, how do you see China in this?
China has not been a member for that, a state party for that a while. I suppose it's a while now, but it wasn't an early joiner. And I think it at first was very unpersuaded that the Arms Trade Treaty was likely to be of any value. So I think it is a positive step that China has joined the treaty. China has its own national rules that it has followed, that it's had for some number of years now, that it applies when it's deciding whether to export arms. Mm-hmm. A well-known rule is the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of state. Now, those rules don't match up, don't align with the criteria or the rules that are in the Arms Trade Treaty about these explicit references to international humanitarian law, international human rights law. So I think there's an ongoing process of speaking to China about how these different sets of rules can be synchronized, if you like. They can apply in practice. The other issue is that China makes that is very important to it is that it won't export to non-state actors, so which is largely the case. I think probably one of the major issues that China needs to address is the risk of diversion, because this is an area where it feels to me that China still needs to do more. So we do find Chinese equipment ending up in places and in the hands of those to whom we are confident was not the intended recipient. But that does seem to happen more with Chinese weapons than with weapons from some other states. So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done. But with China in the Arms Trade Treaty, it creates the space and the place those conversations can take place.
Is sort of engagement, say, between civil society and the Chinese government in the context of the ATT on issues like that?
There's some. I think China does not have a history of that more in-depth level of engagement with civil society that you'll see from countries in Western Europe and North America, for example. So again, I think that's a process, but with China in the treaty, that again creates the space. China acknowledges that civil society has a legitimate role to play in the ongoing treaty management and oversight. So that's again usefully creating the space, which, and all of these things take time. But so it's about giving us that as things move forward over time, we can deepen that level of engagement.
That's very interesting. Now, 10 years after the founding of the ATT, we already were looking back. Now let's look forward a little bit. Where do you think are things headed with regard to the ATT and maybe arms control efforts of this kind in general? Where do you think are we in 10 years from now, in 2034?
Oof. Okay, so I'm going to try and look on this. I'm going to put my optimistic hat on and pick up on this point that I raised, that this question of treaty compliance and actual export licensing decisions, where we are seeing that some initial signs of states acknowledging that there is a need to actually go into this in more detail. And that's where I would like to see progress made. And I think progress is possible. I think, again, it's going to have to be placed in the context of the overall geopolitical strategic environment, which could swamp, if that continues to deteriorate, that could swamp everything, and all bets are off. If we can sustain that kind of broader context, or if things can improve, then I would like to think that we can definitely move in that direction. I think it's also worth bringing into that conversation the role that other international institutions are having, but also national institutions. And so internationally, you have the Human Rights Council that is talking about actual arms transfers in much more detail than the Arms Trade Treaty processes, which kind of seems a bit crazy. Where is the obvious place to be talking about arms transfers? It's inside the Arms Trade Treaty.
Of course.
We've got the ICJ has been involved in rulings relating to Israel. The ICC is getting involved. And again, this is slightly more tangential, in some cases tangential to arms transfers per se, but definitely relevant. So that's bringing a legal pressure to bear. And we're also seeing that nationally, where there are more and more legal challenges to arms transfers. A wave that came through with respect to Saudi Arabia in the Yemen context, and we're seeing another wave now coming through with Israel. And that is possibly extending out. So at first, it's just looking at the actual government decisions per se and looking at government responsibility of whole of government. But we are seeing increasing kind of investigation into whether there could actually be cases brought against individuals, be they politicians who are ultimately responsible for decisions, the officials who are involved in that decision-making process, and even executives from companies. So again, looking at the direction of travel over the last 5 years, if that direction of travel continues, then that could create a very interesting space. We'll be looking into it more detail, and I think we'll start to feed across into the Arms Trade Treaty.
So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is that the real value of the ATT in some ways is that it gives civil society in the exporting countries an opportunity to hold their governments accountable and say, well, if you grant an export license and this violates ATT norms, we can try to stop you under national law. And indeed, there have been these involving the UK and Saudi Arabia or the Yemen war, such like.
And we're starting, most of the initial cases, I think, in Saudi Arabia, it's probably fair to say, did not reference the Arms Trade Treaty per se very strongly. They just talked about the national rules, which in theory should be incorporating everything that's in the ATT, but from this purely legal perspective, it was about the national laws. But we have started to see more reference in these cases to the Arms Trade Treaty, and that I think, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that allows, or that encourages decisions taken in one jurisdiction to start to affect another jurisdiction, because if you've got those same international rules applying, then you can look at what's happening in one national jurisdiction and bring that into the discussion in another. So I think definitely the Arms Trade Treaty is having a positive impact on the way that these kind of rules are starting to be applied across the board more.
One of my questions would be, this is all nice and well in countries in Europe or North America where you have an independent judiciary that allows you to challenge your government now out of the, now I believe 115 member states, you said. A fair number of those don't have the same free judiciary system, and it's a lot harder to hold your government to task in an authoritarian system. Where do you see the value of the ATT in that context?
Certainly that this will work in some places better in some places than in others. But again, we are where we are. We have to deal with what we've got. You have to start somewhere. International law is a long, slow process, and all the weaknesses of international law that apply broadly also apply to the Arms Trade Treaty. But it's not just the Arms Trade Treaty that suffers from this. But so this is what we've been doing for decades now, is in civil society, is to be incremental steps, incremental changes that over time lead up to something very significant. And so we go back virtually 30 years to when the idea of an Arms Trade Treaty was first proposed. And the idea was you were laughed out of the room by state when you were talking about this 30 years ago. It's a process. And it's going to be a lot of years before we get to our perfect destination, if you like.
All right. No, that's good to hear and encouraging. Maybe before we finish this conversation, let's zoom out a little bit from the ATT and look at arms control in general. The way I understand you, the ATT in 2014 was sort of the last big milestone in the arms control world. I think the last time that something really new was being agreed upon. Ever since, we've been, I think, globally seeing a bit of a decline in interest and commitment towards global arms control. So as somebody who knows the field very well, where do you see the next steps for us who are interested in arms control efforts beyond the ATT? What would need to happen to make this planet a safer place?
Well, I mean, there things are still happening. We've seen recently the political declaration of the explosive weapons in populated areas. It's not a legally binding treaty, but that's something which is being referenced by countries that have signed up to it as relevant to international conduct. There are efforts in the area of the killer robots campaign, the automated weapon systems. Artificial intelligence is obviously a fair amount going on with artificial intelligence, and where that heads, we obviously don't know yet. So I think there's certainly stuff bubbling away. Referring back to the Arms Trade Treaty, I don't think we could have agreed the Arms Trade Treaty as it is currently drafted if we were coming into negotiations now. It is a tougher environment, but things are still going on. I suppose maybe what that raises a strategic question there is it worth chasing legal treaties at the moment, or legally binding treaties at the moment, if what you can achieve in that you might be able to get your legally binding treaty, but the ambition that is contained in that treaty may be lower than it would have been a few years ago, or possibly could be in a few years' time. So I think there's a big strategic question about how to fit your kind of specific arms control, arms management goals within that kind of broader geostrategic environment. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it'll differ depending on exactly the area that you're working in. But I just think, being careful about kind of rushing to get agreement, just thinking that through, what the implications of that are, is important. I don't think we've reached the end of the road. So I think there is stuff ongoing, and we should keep on pursuing these different agendas as we go.
Very good. Thank you, Roy. This has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you for reminding us of how far we've come with the ATT, and also underlining the fact that probably in today's environment, we would not be able to get a similar regime agreed by so many member states. And thank you, of course, also for highlighting some of the implementation challenges what the future may bring. With that, we've reached the end of our podcast today. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's all we have time for today, so thank you to our guests for sharing their expertise and knowledge with us, and thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more information, visit the IISS website, and as always, be sure to follow the IISS on X and LinkedIn, where our analysts will be sharing their insights and quick takes. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to the Arms Control Poseur wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you, and until next time.